Cassian Ashworth, the 5th Duke of Ravenwood, had ruined every good thing handed to him before the age of 26. His father's fortune, squandered on racehorses that never won. His mother's porcelain collection, sold off to pay a gambling debt in Brighton. His reputation, dragged so deep through London's drawing rooms that even the most forgiving hostesses stopped sending invitations. So when his uncle, Lord Aldrich Vane, summoned him to the ancestral seat with a letter that read simply, "Marry the girl or lose the estate entirely," Cassian did what any cornered, penniless duke would do. He married the girl. He hadn't seen her face properly until the ceremony itself, held in the dim stone chapel at Ravenwood Keep, with only a tired vicar and 2 servants as witnesses. She stood at the altar in an oversized woolen gown that hung from her shoulders like a grain sack, her dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and her eyes fixed on the flagstone floor as though she were counting the cracks. Her name was Genevieve Marshall. She was Lord Vane's ward, the orphaned daughter of some minor French-born engineer who had died owing Vane money, or so the story went. Cassian had asked his uncle only one question before the wedding. Why her? Vane had smiled that particular smile of his, thin, satisfied, like a man folding a winning hand of cards, and said, "Because she is the only woman in England who would have you, nephew." That stung. Cassian had swallowed it down the way he swallowed everything, with a glass of port and a shrug. Now, barely 3 hours after the vicar had closed his prayer book, Cassian stood alone in the upstairs corridor of the West Wing, loosening his cravat and wondering how his life had managed to become this small. The candles along the hall flickered in a draught that seemed to breathe through the old walls. Somewhere below, the servants had retreated to the kitchens. His new wife had disappeared into the east chamber without a word. She had barely spoken 10 words the entire day, and 5 of those had been, "I do," and "Thank you, Vicar." He was about to pour himself another drink when the floor moved. It was slight at first, a shudder like the trembling of a horse's flank. The crystal decanter on the side table rattled against its silver tray. Cassian paused, his hand hovering over the glass. Then came a sound from deep below, a groan, long and grinding, as though the earth beneath the manor had turned over in its sleep. Fine stone dust drifted down from the ceiling, catching the candlelight like grey snow. Cassian had lived in this house as a boy. The walls of Ravenwood were 4 centuries old. They creaked, they settled, they complained in winter and sighed in summer, but they had never groaned like that. He grabbed a candle and moved toward the staircase. Before he reached the first step, a figure swept past him so quickly he nearly dropped the flame. It was Genevieve. She had shed her heavy bridal gown and was wearing a plain linen shift tucked into a pair of rough wool trousers. Trousers, of all things, with a leather belt cinched at her waist. Her hair was loose now, falling in a dark curtain down her back, and she was carrying an iron lantern she had clearly taken from the servants' passage. "Where on earth are you?" Cassian started. "The foundation vault," she said, already moving down the cellar stairs. Her voice was different. There was no stutter in it, no hesitation. The words came out clipped and sure, the way an officer might speak during a drill. Cassian followed her, more out of bewilderment than anything else. The cellar stairs at Ravenwood spiraled down through 3 levels of old stone, past the wine stores and the cold larder, past the disused root cellar where his grandmother had once kept preserves, and finally into the lowest passage, the foundation vault, where the original medieval builders had carved their support arches directly into the bedrock above the ravine. Genevieve moved through the narrow corridor as though she had walked it 100 times before, though Cassian was certain she had never set foot in this house until that morning. She held the lantern high, and the orange light washed over the ancient stonework in waves. Then she stopped. "There," she said, pointing the lantern toward the far wall. Cassian squinted. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar curve of the great load-bearing arch that supported the west wing above. Then Genevieve stepped closer and traced her finger along a jagged line running diagonally through the keystone. The crack was wide enough to fit a coin into. Around it, the mortar had crumbled into a fine powder that coated the floor like spilled flour. "This arch carries the full lateral weight of the west wing," Genevieve said. Her voice was steady, almost detached, as though she were reading from a technical report. "The keystone has fractured along the grain. If the secondary support pier shifts even another 2 inches, and it will, because the soil beneath it has been hollowed out by water seepage, the entire western face of the house will slide into the ravine before morning." Cassian stared at her. Then he stared at the crack. Then he stared at her again. "How do you know that?" he asked. Genevieve lowered the lantern. For a moment, the old hesitance flickered back across her face, the downcast eyes, the slight curl of her shoulders inward, as though she were trying to make herself smaller. Then it passed. "Because I designed the drainage system your uncle installed 3 years ago," she said quietly. "And I told him then that this arch would fail if he kept diverting water through the lower channels without reinforcing the substructure." He ignored every word I wrote. The second tremor hit before Cassian could respond. The walls shuddered. A chunk of mortar the size of a fist broke loose from the arch and shattered on the floor between them. Cassian looked at his wife, this silent, awkward girl his uncle had dismissed as a burden, and for the first time since the wedding, he felt something other than self-pity. He felt afraid. "Tell me what to do," he said. Genevieve lifted the lantern again, and her jaw tightened with a kind of resolve he had never seen in any drawing room or ballroom in England. "Get every man on this estate out of bed," she said. "We have until dawn." They worked through the night like men possessed. Cassian had roused the groundskeeper, the stable hands, and the 2 remaining estate labourers from their cottages. By the time the first grey light crept over the valley, they had driven 17 oak wedges into the fractured arch and packed the gap with a thick slurry of peat and river clay that Genevieve had mixed herself in a wooden trough, rolling up her sleeves and scooping the cold paste with her bare hands while the men watched in stunned silence. She spoke to them directly, clearly, pointing at specific joints in the stonework and explaining exactly where each wedge needed to sit. The groundskeeper, a weathered man named Holt, who had served the estate for 30 years, kept glancing at Cassian as though waiting for the Duke to overrule this strange young woman giving orders in a cellar at 3 in the morning. Cassian simply nodded each time. He had no better plan. He had no plan at all. By 6:30, the arch was holding. The tremors had stopped. The west wing still stood, though Genevieve warned that the repair was temporary at best, a bandage over a wound that ran much deeper than cracked stone. Cassian found her in the oak-panelled library just after 7, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the cold hearth with a battered tin box open in her lap. She had changed into a plain grey dress, still too large for her frame, still shapeless and dull, and her hair was tied back again in that severe knot. The transformation from the decisive woman in the cellar back to this quiet, folded-up creature was so complete that Cassian might have doubted the whole night had happened, except that his hands were still raw from hauling timber and his shirt was stained with clay. "I think," Cassian said, lowering himself into the leather chair across from her, "that you owe me an explanation." Genevieve looked up. Her eyes were a pale grey-green, the colour of winter sage, and there were dark circles beneath them. She had clearly slept even less than he had. "I owe you a great deal more than that," she said. "But the explanation is a fair place to begin." She lifted a sheaf of papers from the tin box and held them out. Cassian took them carefully. The pages were covered in precise drawings, cross-sections of arches, load-bearing calculations, water flow diagrams, all rendered in a neat, confident hand with measurements marked in fine black ink. Some of the sheets were yellowed with age, others were newer, the ink still sharp. Every single one bore a small monogram in the bottom corner. G.M. "These are yours," Cassian said. It was a statement, though his voice carried more surprise than he intended. "Every one. My father was Guillaume Marchand. He came to England from Rouen in 1803 to work as a civil engineer for the canal companies in the Midlands. He designed locks, aqueducts, drainage systems, anything that involved water moving through stone. He taught me everything he knew before he died. She paused. I was 14. Cassian turned through the drawings slowly. He understood perhaps a quarter of the technical notations, but even he could recognize the quality of the draftsmanship. These were the work of someone with genuine training, real skill. After my father died, I became Lord Vane's ward. My father had borrowed money from him years earlier to fund a canal survey in Shropshire. Vane held the debt over me like a chain around my neck. He took me into his household, gave me a room in the servants' wing, and put me to work. Doing what? Drawing, calculating, designing. Genevieve's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as though she were describing the weather. Vane had secured contracts with 3 canal companies across the north. He needed an engineer to produce the technical plans, the stress calculations, the material specifications, the foundation surveys. He used my work and filed the patents under his own name, every single one. She reached into the tin box and pulled out a bundle of folded contracts, each one stamped with a heavy red wax seal. Cassian recognized the seal immediately. It was the crest of the Vane family, a serpent coiled around an oak branch. These are the original filings, Genevieve said. The drafts are in my hand, with my calculations. The final submissions are in Vane's name. He had a clerk copy my drawings onto fresh paper and destroyed the originals. Or so he thought. I kept duplicates of everything. Hidden. Always hidden. Cassian set the papers down on his knee. The room was very quiet. Outside, a wood pigeon called from the bare elm trees along the drive. And the clothing, he said slowly. The way you dress, the way you speak, or rather, the way you pretend to speak. The stutter, the hunched shoulders, all of it. Genevieve's mouth tightened. Vane could not afford to let anyone see me clearly. If I appeared competent, if I appeared educated, someone might ask questions. Someone might wonder why a young woman with an engineer's training was living as a silent dependent in a lord's household. So he dressed me in cast-offs, 2 sizes too large. He told visitors I was simple-minded. He forbade me from speaking at meals. And over time, the performance became easier than I would like to admit. You wear a mask long enough, it starts to fit. Cassian sat with that for a long moment. He thought about his uncle's thin smile at the wedding. Because she is the only woman in England who would have you. The cruelty of the remark had landed differently then, aimed at Cassian's vanity, his ruined prospects. Now he understood it was aimed at Genevieve too. Vane had dressed her as something disposable and handed her off like a parcel, certain that a careless, debt-ridden duke would never look closely enough to see what he actually held. And the marriage itself, Cassian could see the shape of it now, cold and deliberate as one of Genevieve's engineering drawings. Vane had known the foundation arch was failing. He had known because Genevieve had warned him years ago, and he had ignored her warnings to save the cost of reinforcement. By marrying Genevieve to Cassian and burying her at Ravenwood, Vane accomplished 2 things at once. He silenced the one person who could prove his engineering fraud. And when the estate inevitably collapsed, as it was meant to, as it nearly had last night, the blame would fall squarely on Cassian's shoulders. The reckless duke who let his inheritance crumble, Vane would swoop in with a foreclosure claim, seize the land, and nobody would spare a thought for the quiet wife standing in the wreckage. He used both of us, Cassian said. Genevieve met his gaze. There was no self-pity in her expression, no plea for sympathy, just a calm, measuring steadiness, like a surveyor sighting along a level line. Yes, she said, and he will keep using us, unless we stop him. Cassian leaned forward in his chair. His jaw was set, and for the first time in years, the restless, self-destructive energy that had driven him through gambling halls and racetracks found something solid to push against. Then we stop him, he said. Tell me where we start. They started with rain. 2 days after the wedding, the sky above Ravenwood turned the color of wet slate and simply opened. The rain came down in sheets so thick that Cassian could barely see the stable block from the library window. It hammered the roof tiles, overflowed the gutters and turned the gravel drive into a shallow brown river that wound its way down toward the valley floor. Genevieve had predicted it. She had spent the previous afternoon studying the old barometric instruments in the estate office, a dusty mercury glass and a weather journal kept by Cassian's late father, and announced with quiet certainty that heavy, unseasonal rainfall was coming from the north within 36 hours. Cassian had raised an eyebrow. She had been right to the hour. "The upper gorge," Genevieve said on the morning of the second day, standing at the kitchen doorway while rain lashed the courtyard stones. She was wearing a heavy oilskin coat that belonged to Holt, the groundskeeper, belted at the waist with a length of rope because the sleeves hung past her fingertips. Beneath it, she had on a pair of sturdy leather boots that were also too large, stuffed at the toes with rags to keep them from slipping. She looked, Cassian thought, like a child playing dress-up in her father's wardrobe. But the expression on her face was anything but childish. "The Blackwood River feeds through the upper gorge before it reaches the estate," she continued, pulling a folded map from inside the coat and spreading it across the kitchen table. The map was one of her own, hand-drawn, marked with elevation lines and flow calculations in that precise, confident script. There is a primary water wheel at the gorge mouth that drives the estate's grain mill and the sawing apparatus. The wheel is anchored by 4 main timber supports sunk into the riverbed. Those supports were installed in 1791. They have not been replaced since. 34 years, Cassian said, in a river that freezes every winter and floods every spring. The wood will be rotten through the heartwood by now. If the current doubles, and it will, by this evening, those supports will buckle, the wheel will break free, and the debris will jam against the narrow passage at the gorge throat. That creates a natural dam, which means the water backs up and floods the lower valley, including the foundations we just repaired. Cassian was already reaching for his riding coat. They rode out together on 2 of the sturdier estate horses, leaning into the wind as the rain drove against them in stinging gusts. The track up to the upper gorge was a narrow, rutted path that wound through dense beechwoods before climbing steeply along the river's edge. The Blackwood was already swollen beyond its usual banks, brown water churning over rocks that were normally a full foot above the waterline. The sound of it was enormous, a constant, deep-throated roar that swallowed the noise of the horses' hooves and the creaking of wet saddle leather. They reached the water wheel just before midday. Cassian had seen it 100 times as a boy, a great oak wheel taller than a man, turning slowly with the steady current. Now it was shuddering in its frame like a living thing trying to tear itself loose. The river surged around its paddles, throwing white spray into the air, and the timber supports groaned with each pulse of current. Genevieve dismounted and moved to the edge of the gorge, gripping a birch sapling for balance as she leaned out over the rushing water. Cassian's stomach lurched, watching her. "The upstream pair is already shifting," she called back over the roar. 6 inches, perhaps more. We need to brace them from the downstream side before the next surge, or they will fold inward." "With what?" Cassian shouted. They had brought tools, a hand axe, a coil of heavy rope, an iron pry bar, but nothing that could stand against the force of that current. Genevieve pointed upstream to where a mature oak had fallen across the bank, its root plate torn from the sodden earth by the storm. "That trunk. If we can cut a 10-foot section and wedge it diagonally between the downstream support and the gorge wall, it will act as a temporary buttress. The angle has to be precise, 40 degrees from the base, bearing against the flat rock shelf on the eastern side." Cassian stared at her for a moment through the driving rain. Water streamed down her face and dripped from the brim of Holt's oversized hat, which she had jammed onto her head before they left. She looked half-drowned and entirely certain. He grabbed the axe. It took them the better part of 2 hours. Cassian stripped off his riding coat and hacked at the fallen oak in his shirt sleeves, the rain plastering the linen to his back while the wind pulled at him sideways. The wood was green and hard, and every stroke sent a jolt up through his arms and shoulders. Genevieve worked beside him with the pry bar, levering away branches and clearing the section they needed. She was soaked through to the skin, her grey dress clinging to her frame beneath the open oilskin, but she moved with that same focused, mechanical efficiency he had seen in the cellar. No wasted motion, no hesitation. When the section was cut, they rolled it to the water's edge, using the rope as a crude lever system. Cassian waded into the shallows, gasping at the cold, and hauled the log into position against the groaning support beam, while Genevieve stood on the bank, calling out adjustments. 2 inches left. Angle it steeper. Now drive it hard against the shelf. The current tore at his legs and tried to pull him downstream. He set his boots against the riverbed stones and pushed until his vision blurred. The brace held. They stood on the bank afterward, breathing hard, listening to the river rage against the reinforced supports. The wheel still shuddered, but the timber frame had stopped its sickening inward lean. The brace would hold for a few days, perhaps a week if the rain eased. Genevieve sat down heavily on a flat rock, pulling the oilskin tighter around her shoulders. Her hands were shaking, from cold, from effort, from the slow release of concentration. Cassian dropped onto the rock beside her and said nothing for a long while. The rain continued to fall, but softer now, as though the storm were catching its breath before the next onslaught. "Timber will not hold," Genevieve said finally. Her voice was hoarse. "We need iron. Cast iron tension rods, fitted to specification. There is a foundry 3 days south of here at Oakhaven. My father dealt with the master smith there before he died." Cassian wiped the rain from his face with a muddy hand. Every muscle in his body ached. His fingers were numb. He had not worked this hard in his entire privileged, wasteful life. "Then we go to Oakhaven," he said. Genevieve glanced at him. There was something new in her expression, still cautious, still guarded, but laced now with the faintest thread of surprise. As though she had expected him to refuse, as though she had been waiting for him to walk away and pour himself another glass of port and let the whole estate wash into the gorge. He held her gaze. He did not look away. "First thing tomorrow," he said. The carriage they took was the only one left on the estate that still had 4 sound wheels. It was an old brougham, black paint peeling along the doors, with a cracked leather seat inside that smelled of mildew and horse blankets. The springs were shot, and every rut in the road sent a jolt through Cassian's spine that he felt in his teeth. Genevieve did not seem to notice. She sat across from him on the opposite bench, her tin box wedged between her feet and a leather satchel full of drawings balanced on her knees. Within the first hour of the journey, she had spread 3 sheets of calculations across her lap and was working through figures by the unsteady light of a tallow candle jammed into a tin holder that she had nailed, actually nailed, with a small hammer from her coat pocket into the wooden panel beside the window. Cassian watched her work. He had nothing else to do. The road south from Ravenwood wound through empty moorland for the first 20 miles, and the rain, though lighter now, still streaked the carriage windows in long grey lines that made the passing landscape look like a watercolour left out in the weather. "What are those?" he asked, nodding toward the papers. "Supply manifests," Genevieve said, without looking up. "I am calculating the exact quantity of iron we need. 4 tension rods, each 9 feet in length, 2 inches in diameter, with threaded ends for bolting into the anchor plates. The alloy must be a specific blend, high-carbon pig iron with a small percentage of manganese for flexibility under lateral stress. If we get the mixture wrong, the rods will be too brittle. They will snap under the first heavy frost." "You have this all memorized?" "I designed the formula when I was 19. My father's notebooks had the foundation, but the manganese ratio was my own addition. I tested it on scale models in Vane's workshop before he took the papers away from me." She paused, her pencil hovering over a column of numbers. "He let me keep working for nearly 2 years after my father died. I think he found it amusing at first, the orphan girl scratching away at her little drawings. Then he realized the drawings were worth money, and the amusement stopped." The carriage lurched over a deep rut, and the candle flame guttered sideways, throwing wild shadows across the low ceiling. Genevieve steadied her papers with one hand and continued writing with the other, barely breaking her rhythm. Cassian noticed that her handwriting during these technical passages was completely different from the cramped, uncertain script he had seen on the marriage register that morning. Here, the letters were bold, evenly spaced, unhesitating. A different person entirely held the pencil. "May I ask you something?" Cassian said. Genevieve glanced up. "You have been asking me things for 2 days. I do not think you require permission at this stage." Cassian almost smiled. Almost. The stutter. At the wedding, when the vicar asked you to repeat the vows, you could barely get the words out. I thought you were going to faint. And yet down in that cellar, an hour later, you were giving orders to grown men like a foreman on a building site. Which one is real? Genevieve set her pencil down. The candle flame steadied, and in its warm light the sharp angles of her face softened slightly. She was not beautiful in the way London society measured beauty. She had no rosebud mouth, no fashionable pallor, no delicate ringlets framing a heart-shaped face. Her features were strong, her jaw firm, her brows straight and dark above those pale grey-green eyes. But there was a clarity to her face when she stopped trying to hide behind it, a kind of clean, architectural precision that Cassian was only beginning to notice. "They are both real," she said. "That is the trouble with wearing a disguise for 10 years. The disguise grows roots. When I am working, when the problem in front of me is stone and water and mathematics, the stutter disappears because I am not thinking about myself. I am thinking about load-bearing capacities and hydraulic gradients. There is no room for fear in an equation. But when I stand in a chapel full of strangers, and a man I have never met is putting a ring on my finger, and I know that every person in the room is looking at me and seeing exactly what Vane wants them to see, the plain, simple-minded ward, the charitable burden, then the fear fills up every space the equations leave behind." The carriage rolled on through the grey afternoon. Somewhere ahead, the road descended into a wooded valley where the trees arched overhead like the ribbing of a cathedral nave. The light dimmed, and the rain on the roof softened to a quiet murmur. "I spent 6 seasons in London," Cassian said after a while. "I attended more balls and dinners and card parties than I can count. I was surrounded by hundreds of people, and every single one of them saw exactly what I showed them. The careless young duke throwing his inheritance around like confetti. And I let them see it, because it was easier than showing them anything else." Genevieve looked at him steadily. "What would you have shown them?" Cassian considered the question. Through the window, the dark trunks of beech trees slid past like columns in an endless hall. "I have absolutely no idea," he said. "That is the honest answer. I never thought about it long enough to find out. There was always another party, another card table, another horse race, another way to avoid sitting still." "And now you are sitting in a broken carriage on a mud road in the middle of nowhere, travelling to a foundry to buy iron rods for a house that might fall down before you get back." "Yes." "How does it feel?" Cassian looked down at his hands. They were still raw from the axe work at the gorge. There was river mud under his fingernails and a deep blister on his right palm that stung every time he closed his fist. These were not the hands of a duke. They were the hands of a labourer, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he did not mind. "It feels like the first useful thing I have ever done," he said. Genevieve held his gaze for a moment longer, then picked up her pencil and returned to her calculations. But there was something different in the set of her shoulders now, a fraction less rigid, a degree less guarded, as though a bolt somewhere deep inside her machinery had loosened by a single careful turn. They reached the outskirts of the Oakhaven Valley by dusk. The foundry smoke was visible first, a dark smudge against the pale evening sky, rising from behind a ridge of bare hills. Then came the sound, faint but steady, carried on the damp wind. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, over and over, like the heartbeat of something enormous and iron-boned. "We will need to be careful," Genevieve said, folding her papers and tucking them back into the satchel. "If Vane has agents watching the northern supply routes, and he will, then he already knows we left the estate. We may have a day's advantage, perhaps less." Cassian straightened his coat, brushed the worst of the mud from his cuffs, and squared his shoulders. He was a duke, after all. A ruined, debt-ridden, clay-stained duke with blistered hands and a broken carriage, but a duke nonetheless. Titles still opened doors in England, even when the man carrying them had nothing left behind his name but stubbornness. "Then we had better not waste the morning," he said, and stepped out into the cold evening air to meet the smoke and the sound of iron. The Oakhaven foundry sat at the bottom of a narrow valley, like a beast crouched in a hollow. 3 long stone buildings with blackened chimneys ran parallel along the riverbank, connected by covered iron walkways and open coal yards where apprentices in leather aprons shoveled fuel into wheelbarrows despite the early hour. The air tasted of sulphur and hot metal, and even from the yard gate, the heat rolling out of the open forge doors was enough to dry the damp from Cassian's coat. They had slept the night at a coaching inn 2 miles up the road, separate rooms, cold supper, thin ale, and arrived at the foundry just after 7. Cassian had dressed as well as his limited travelling wardrobe allowed, a clean shirt, his least wrinkled waistcoat, and a cravat tied with enough care to suggest he still had a valet somewhere. Genevieve walked beside him in her usual shapeless grey, the leather satchel pressed against her side like a shield, her heavy travelling hood pulled forward over her face. The master smith was a man named Josiah Corran. He was waiting for them in the main casting hall, a vast cathedral-like space with a vaulted brick ceiling stained amber by decades of forge smoke. Corran was perhaps 50, built like a draft horse, with forearms thicker than Cassian's thighs and a face that looked as though it had been carved from the same pig iron he worked with daily. He stood beside the central furnace with his arms folded across a scorched leather apron, watching them approach with the particular expression of a man who had already decided to say no. "Your Grace," Corran said, offering a nod that was technically respectful but contained not an ounce of deference. Smiths in the northern foundries were their own breed. They answered to fire and metal, and a duke's title carried about as much weight as a paper crown in a place where everything was measured by what it could withstand. "Master Corran," Cassian said, "I appreciate you seeing us at short notice. I will come directly to the matter. I need 4 custom-cast tension rods, 9 feet in length, 2-inch diameter, threaded at both ends. High-carbon alloy with manganese tempering, delivered within the week." Corran's expression did not change. "And how does your Grace intend to pay for such an order?" Cassian had anticipated this. He reached into his coat and produced a letter of credit drawn on his London bank, the last shred of financial authority he possessed, backed by the Ravenwood estate itself. He held it out. Corran did not take it. "I have heard things about the Ravenwood accounts, Your Grace. Rumours travel faster than carriages in these valleys. Word is your estate is mortgaged to the chimney pots. Your tenants have not been paid since Michaelmas, and your uncle Lord Vane holds the majority of your outstanding debts." Corran shook his head slowly. "I run an honest foundry. I cannot pour iron on the promise of a man whose own banker would not lend him the price of a saddle." The words landed like a slap. Cassian felt the heat rise in his face, not from the forge, but from the old familiar sting of humiliation that had followed him from every creditor's office and every whispered conversation in every London club he had been quietly asked to leave. His first instinct was to argue, to pull rank, to remind this soot-covered tradesman exactly who he was speaking to. But rank without money was an empty chair at a full table, and they both knew it. Before Cassian could form a response, Genevieve stepped forward. She moved out from behind him with a quietness that made Corran glance at her as though noticing her for the first time. She reached up and pushed the heavy travelling hood back from her face, and the forge light caught her features fully. The strong jaw, the steady grey-green eyes, the dark hair pulled back from a high forehead. "Master Corran," she said. Her voice carried cleanly through the hammering and hissing of the forge floor, and there was no stutter in it. "The alloy your foundry uses for bridge-grade tension components, what is the manganese ratio in your current standard?" Corran blinked. Whatever he had expected from the Duke's quiet companion, it was not a question about metallurgical composition. 3/4% by weight, he said slowly. "And what was the ratio before you changed your standard? before 1821, when your foundry was still casting under the old Whitworth specifications. Corin's eyes narrowed. 0.5%? But we abandoned that mixture because it was too brittle under repeated thermal cycling. The rods would hold for 2 seasons and then fracture along the grain during the first hard frost. Yes, Genevieve said, because the carbon base was too high for that manganese level. The solution was to reduce the carbon by 1/8 of a percentage point and increase the manganese to 5/8, creating a softer matrix with greater lateral flexibility. That formula was submitted to your foundry in the spring of 1819 by a consulting engineer named Guillaume Marchand, who had been commissioned by Lord Vane to improve the tensile performance of lock gate fittings for the Shropshire Union Canal. Your foundry adopted the revised formula within 6 months and has used it as your workshop standard ever since. The casting hall seemed to go quiet around them. Even the apprentices at the far end of the floor had paused in their work, sensing the shift in atmosphere the way animals sense a change in the weather. Corin stared at Genevieve for a long moment. "Guillaume Marchand," he said. "I remember him. Small fellow, French accent, hands like a watchmaker. Brilliant man. He came to this foundry twice and sat with me over my own crucibles and taught me things about iron that I had been getting wrong for 20 years. He paused. He died. 1815 or thereabouts. 1816, Genevieve said. He was my father." Corin looked at her with new eyes. Cassian could see the recalculation happening behind the smith's weathered face, the same recalculation Cassian himself had gone through in the cellar 2 nights ago, the same sudden, jarring revision of everything he had assumed about the woman standing in front of him. "The revised formula," Corin said slowly. "Vane submitted it under his own name, claimed his own engineers had developed it. They had not. I can reproduce the original calculations from memory, and I have my father's working notebooks in this satchel. The formula is a Marchand design, and I am the last Marchand alive." Corin uncrossed his arms. He looked at Cassian, then back at Genevieve, and something shifted in his granite expression, a crack in the professional skepticism, letting through something warmer. Respect, perhaps. Recognition. 4 rods, he said. 9 feet, 2-inch diameter, 5/8 manganese. I will have them cast and cooled within 3 days, and I will take no payment until the estate is standing and the accounts are settled. Genevieve extended her hand. Corin took it, the master smith's enormous scarred fist closing around her smaller fingers, and they shook once, firmly, as equals. Cassian stood to the side and watched this happen. He had walked into this foundry expecting to trade on his title. His title had been worthless. The thing that opened the door, the thing that turned a flat refusal into a handshake, was a 19-year-old girl's memory of her dead father's metallurgy notes and the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. He was beginning to understand that he had married someone extraordinary. He was also beginning to understand that his uncle had known it all along and had spent 10 years making absolutely certain that nobody else ever would. They loaded the carriage with provisions for the return journey, and Corin sent one of his own apprentices to ride ahead and secure fresh horses at the halfway coaching station. The rods would follow by heavy cart within 3 days. As they pulled away from the foundry yard, Cassian turned to Genevieve in the dim interior of the carriage. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. Genevieve looked out of the window at the forge smoke rising into the pale sky. She said nothing, but her hand, resting on the leather satchel in her lap, trembled once, very slightly, and then was still. They smelled the trouble before they saw it. The return journey to Ravenwood had taken 2 days, pushing the horses hard through muddy roads that sucked at the carriage wheels like something alive and hungry. Cassian had dozed in fitful stretches while Genevieve sat awake beside the window, watching the countryside roll past with the vigilance of someone who had learned long ago that rest was a luxury rarely offered twice. They crossed onto estate land just after noon on the 7th day since the wedding. The rain had eased to a thin, persistent drizzle that hung in the valley like gauze, softening the outlines of the hills and muffling sound. The first thing Cassian noticed was the smell, a thick, marshy stench of stagnant water and rotting vegetation that had no business reaching this far up the valley road. The lower meadows near the river always carried a damp, earthy scent after heavy rain, but this was different. This was the smell of water sitting where it should not be sitting. The second thing he noticed was the silence. The Blackwood River, which should have been audible from half a mile away as a constant rushing murmur, was barely whispering. The sound was wrong, too thin, too quiet for a river swollen by a week of heavy rainfall. "Stop the carriage," Genevieve said. She was out of the door before the wheels had fully stopped, walking quickly across the wet grass toward the ridge that overlooked the lower spillway. Cassian followed, his boots sinking into the soft ground with each step. When they reached the ridge and looked down, he understood. The lower spillway was the estate's primary flood defense, a broad stone channel fitted with two heavy oak sluice gates that could be raised or lowered by iron counterweight chains to control the flow of water from the upper river into the drainage basin below the manor. In normal conditions, the gates stood partially open, allowing a steady, managed stream to pass through. The system was old but functional, designed, Cassian now knew, by Genevieve's father decades earlier. The gates were shut. Completely, absolutely shut, and wedged into the mechanism on both sides, jammed hard against the iron tracks that guided the gates up and down, were thick oak logs, dozens of them, rammed into the works with such force that the iron guide rails had bent inward under the pressure. The logs were dark with water, swollen tight against each other, forming a solid mass of wood and iron that no amount of pulling or prying from above could shift. Behind the sealed gates, the river water had backed up into a broad, shallow lake that was already lapping at the base of the lower foundation walls. Another foot of rise, and the water would reach the drainage channels that ran directly beneath the repaired arch. "This was done deliberately," Genevieve said. Her voice was quiet, but edged with something Cassian had not heard from her before, a cold, tightly controlled fury. "How can you tell?" "Because those logs were cut to length. Look at the ends. They are sawn, clean and square. Someone measured the width of the sluice tracks and cut timber to fit exactly. This is not storm debris. This is sabotage." A voice called out from the tree line to their left. "Your Grace." Cassian turned. A man stepped out from the shadow of the beeches, tall, narrow-shouldered, wearing a dark riding coat and carrying a walking stick with a brass handle. Cassian recognized him immediately. It was Whitmore, Lord Vane's head steward, the man who managed Vane's properties across 3 counties and who carried his master's authority the way a hound carries a scent. Behind Whitmore, 4 men emerged from the trees, farm labourers by the look of them, broad, rough-handed men in muddy smocks, hired from one of Vane's tenant farms and brought here for a specific purpose. They arranged themselves across the path that led down to the spillway, standing shoulder to shoulder with the easy confidence of men who had been told they would face no consequences. "The gates are to remain closed, Your Grace," Whitmore said. His tone was polite, measured, as though he were delivering a routine instruction about the Morning Post. "Lord Vane has ordered a full structural assessment of the lower foundations. Until that assessment is complete, the spillway is to remain sealed for the safety of the downstream tenants." "Safety," Cassian repeated. "Indeed, Your Grace. Your uncle is deeply concerned about the structural integrity of the estate. He has retained a surveyor to inspect the lower walls, and until that inspection is carried out, the water must be held back to prevent any accidental damage to the surrounding properties." Cassian stared at Whitmore. The logic was perfectly inverted. Holding the water back was precisely what would cause the damage. The rising lake behind the sealed gates was the weapon, and the inspection was the excuse to keep it loaded. Vane was drowning the foundations from below, slowly and legally, so that when the walls finally gave way, he could stand in front of a magistrate and claim the collapse was due to the Duke's own neglect. "These men are trespassing on my land," Cassian said. He kept his voice level, though the anger beneath it was building like pressure behind a dam of its own. "This is Ravenwood estate property. You have no authority here, Whitmore. None of you do." Whitmore's expression flickered, the briefest crack in his professional composure. He had expected the Duke to bluster, to shout, perhaps to storm off and write an indignant letter to his solicitor. He had not expected the quiet, grounded firmness in Cassian's voice, the stance of a man who had spent the past week hauling timber and mixing morite in a cellar and riding through storms, and who had discovered, somewhere along the way, that he actually cared about the ground he was standing on. "Remove yourselves from this estate," Cassian said. "All of you. Now." The hired men looked at Whitmore. Whitmore hesitated, calculating. Then, with a thin smile that reminded Cassian unpleasantly of his uncle, he tipped his hat, turned on his heel, and walked back into the trees. The laborers followed, one by one, melting into the dripping beeches like shadows returning to their corners. Cassian let out a long breath. Then he turned and found Genevieve already gone from his side. She was halfway down the slope toward the spillway, picking her way across the wet stones, with the satchel slung across her body and a heavy iron pry bar in her right hand, taken, Cassian guessed, from the toolbox strapped to the back of the carriage. The stone wall beside the sluice gates was slick with moss and river spray, dropping 15 feet to the churning waterline, where the backed-up river pressed against the sealed gates with a low, constant moan. "Genevieve!" Cassian called, starting down the slope after her. "The counterweight chain," she called back, already lowering herself over the edge of the wall. Her boots found a narrow ledge of jutting stone, and she pressed her body flat against the wet masonry, inching sideways toward the iron housing where the gate mechanism was anchored. "The logs are jammed into the upper tracks, but the counterweight release is on the downstream side below the waterline. If I can reach the manual release lever and trip the chain, the gate will drop under its own weight and the logs will be pushed clear by the current." "You will fall in." "Then I will get wet." She reached the housing, braced one foot against a protruding bolt head, and leaned out over the water with the pry bar extended toward a rusted iron lever half submerged in the churning flow. The spray soaked her within seconds. Her fingers whitened around the pry bar as she hooked the lever and pulled. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the lever shifted, with a grinding screech of old iron. The counterweight chain rattled loose inside its housing, and the nearest sluice gate dropped 6 inches with a shuddering bang that Cassian felt through the soles of his boots. The backed-up water surged through the widening gap, carrying the jammed logs with it in a tumbling, crashing rush of timber and brown foam that swept downstream and scattered across the drainage basin like kindling. Genevieve pulled herself back onto the ledge, breathing hard, her hair plastered to her face and her dress soaked through to the skin. Cassian reached down from the top of the wall, grabbed her forearm, and hauled her up onto solid ground. They stood there for a moment, side by side, watching the water drain through the opened gates and the level behind the spillway begin to fall. The foundations were safe. The lower walls would hold. Vane's slow, quiet drowning had been stopped with a pry bar and a pair of cold, steady hands. "That man will come back," Cassian said. Genevieve wrung the water from her hair and looked up the valley toward the dark hills where the clouds were already thickening again. "Of course he will," she said, "and next time he will bring more than a steward and 4 farmhands." The storm returned on the 8th night, as though it had simply been gathering its strength. Cassian woke to the sound of the wind slamming against the east-facing windows with a fury that rattled the lead casements in their frames. Rain hammered the roof in sheets so heavy that the gutters overflowed within minutes, sending cascades of water down the stone walls and pooling across the courtyard in dark, spreading mirrors. He pulled on his boots and coat and went downstairs to find Genevieve already at work. She had taken over his private drafting room, a long, narrow chamber on the first floor that his father had once used for estate correspondence. The room had a single, tall window overlooking the valley, a cold fireplace that nobody had bothered to lay since autumn, and a massive mahogany table that took up most of the floor space. The table was now buried under paper. Genevieve had spread every map, survey, and drawing she possessed across the mahogany surface, anchoring the corners with candlesticks, ink bottles, and a heavy brass ruler that must have weighed 3 pounds. The candles, 9 of them, arranged in a rough arc across the table, threw a warm, unsteady light that made the inked lines on the maps seem to pulse and shift like veins beneath skin. She did not look up when Cassian entered. She was standing over the largest map, a topographical survey of the entire Ravenwood Valley that she had drawn herself, based on her father's original notes and her own observations over the past week. The map showed every contour line, every watercourse, every rock formation between the upper gorge and the lower meadows. It was, Cassian thought, the most detailed rendering of his own land he had ever seen, and he had lived here as a child. "The spillway will not be enough," she said, still studying the map. Her right hand held a stick of red chalk, and she was making small, precise marks along the river's path. "Clearing the sluice gates bought us time, but the main problem has not changed. The river is rising faster than the existing channels can drain it. The upper gorge is acting like a funnel. All the rainfall from the northern hills is being compressed into a single, narrow passage, and the volume is increasing every hour." A tremor ran through the floor beneath their feet. Somewhere deep below, the repaired arch groaned under the shifting weight of saturated earth. The candle flames shivered in unison, and a thin trickle of dust drifted down from a crack in the ceiling plaster. "How much time do we have?" Cassian asked. Genevieve picked up a sheet of calculations from the far end of the table, dense columns of numbers that meant nothing to Cassian, but clearly told her everything she needed to know. "At the current rate of rise, the river will crest within 3 days. When it does, the volume of water passing through the gorge will exceed anything the spillway can handle by a factor of 4. The lower foundations will be submerged within hours. The repaired arch will fail by morning." "And the iron rods from Corran?" "Due tomorrow. They will reinforce the arch, but reinforcing a wall that is underwater is meaningless. We need to reduce the volume of water reaching the foundations in the first place. We need to send it somewhere else." She leaned over the map and drew a long red chalk line from a point high on the eastern ridge, curving down across the slope in a smooth arc that bypassed the manor entirely and terminated at a broad, flat depression in the landscape, half a mile south of the estate, an old quarry basin that had been abandoned for decades. "A diversion channel," Cassian said, tracing the red line with his eyes, "cut through the limestone ridge at this point." Genevieve tapped the chalk against a spot on the map where the ridge narrowed to a thin spine of rock, perhaps 40 feet across. "The limestone here is already fractured along natural fault lines. I have studied the geology from my father's surveys. If we place charges along the 3 primary fracture points and detonate them in sequence, the rock will split cleanly along the grain. The gap will be wide enough to divert the main flow westward into the old quarry basin, where it can spread out harmlessly across 50 acres of empty ground." Cassian stared at the map. The elegance of the idea was startling. Instead of fighting the river head-on, they would simply step aside and let it pass. The flood would pour through the gap in the ridge like water through an opened door, draining the pressure from the gorge and leaving the manor foundations high and dry. "You want to blow up a hillside," he said. "I want to open a door that nature already built. The fractures are there, the fault lines are there. I am simply asking us to finish what the earth started." She set down the chalk and picked up the brass ruler, laying it along the red line to check the angle. "The critical factor is precision. If the charges are placed too far apart, the rock will shatter unevenly, and the channel will be too narrow to carry the full volume. Too close together, and the blast will destabilize the entire ridge, including the section that supports the road above. Every charge must sit exactly on the fault line, at exactly the depth I specify." "How do you know where the fault lines are?" Genevieve reached beneath the pile of maps and pulled out a battered notebook bound in brown leather. The cover was soft with age, and the pages inside were filled with a handwriting that Cassian recognized as different from Genevieve's own, looser, more hurried, with small sketches of rock formations scattered between the text. "My father surveyed this ridge in 1809, she said. "He was hired to assess whether the limestone was suitable for canal lock construction. He mapped every crack, every layer, every weak point in the stone. His conclusion was that the ridge was too fractured for commercial quarrying, but perfectly suited for controlled demolition if the need ever arose. She opened the notebook to a page marked with a thin red ribbon. The sketch showed a cross-section of the ridge, with 3 diagonal lines drawn through the rock at carefully measured angles. Beside each line, Guillaume Marchand had written a series of numbers, depths, distances, powder quantities, in his neat, French-inflected hand. "He left you the answer," Cassian said quietly. "He left me the geology. The answer I worked out myself." Genevieve picked up the red chalk again and began marking the precise locations for the charges on the topographical map, cross-referencing each mark against her father's notebook and her own calculations. Her hand moved with absolute certainty, and the room fell silent except for the scratch of chalk on paper, the drumming of rain against the window, and the distant, restless groan of the river pressing against the valley walls. Cassian pulled a chair to the far end of the table and sat down. He picked up the brass ruler when she needed it held steady, passed her fresh candles when the old ones gutted down to stubs, and kept the fire fed with coal from the scuttle beside the hearth, a fire he had laid himself, clumsily, with newspaper twists and too much kindling, because there were no servants awake at this hour, and he was learning, slowly, that a duke's hands were no different from anyone else's when it came to useful work. They worked through the night. By the time the first grey light touched the window, the blueprint was complete, every charge point marked, every angle calculated, every cubic foot of displaced rock accounted for. Genevieve set down her chalk, pressed both palms flat against the table, and closed her eyes for a long moment. "Will it work?" Cassian asked. She opened her eyes. The candlelight had burned low, and her face was drawn with exhaustion. But beneath the tiredness, there was something unshakable, a certainty that came from years of doing the mathematics, checking the figures, trusting the numbers when everything else in her life had proved unreliable. "It will work," she said, "if we do it exactly right." Dawn came without a sunrise. The sky simply shifted from black to a flat, heavy grey that pressed down on the valley like a lid. The rain had slowed to a cold, steady drizzle that soaked through clothing within minutes and turned every surface to a slick, treacherous glaze. The hills above Ravenwood looked like the backs of sleeping animals, dark and wet and motionless beneath the low clouds. Cassian stood in the courtyard at 5:30, watching the estate labourers assemble. There were 11 of them, every able-bodied man left on the Ravenwood payroll, plus Holt, the groundskeeper, and his teenage son, who had volunteered without being asked. They carried heavy iron pickaxes, shovels with ash handles worn smooth by years of use, and coils of thick hemp rope slung over their shoulders. Their faces were grim and tired. Most of them had been working double shifts since the first tremor, shoring up walls and clearing drainage ditches, and the strain showed in the deep lines around their eyes and the careful way they moved their aching limbs. Cassian had spoken to each of them individually the evening before. He had not ordered them to come. He had explained what was needed, what the risks were, and what would happen to the estate, to their homes, their livelihoods, their families, if the river crested without the diversion channel in place. Every one of them had shown up. The powder had arrived at midnight, delivered by a quarryman from the village of Stonebridge, who owed Holt a favour stretching back 15 years. 3 small kegs of blasting powder, each packed in straw and wrapped in oilskin against the damp. Genevieve had inspected each keg by candlelight, checking the grain quality and moisture content with the practiced eye of someone who understood exactly what black powder could do when it was right and what it could do when it was wrong. "The slope is steep," Genevieve said, addressing the assembled crew from the back of the supply cart. She had her father's notebook open in one hand and a rolled map tucked under her arm. The oversized oilskin coat made her look small against the grey sky, but her voice carried across the courtyard without strain. "The footing will be poor. We will be working on exposed limestone in the rain, and the rock will be slippery enough to send a man down the hillside if he loses his balance. Rope lines will be fixed along the working face before anyone steps onto the shelf. Nobody climbs without a tether. Is that clear?" The men nodded. None of them seemed surprised to be taking instructions from a woman. Whatever reservations they might have held a week ago had been thoroughly dismantled by the sight of her standing waist-deep in freezing water at the sluice gates, hauling on a rusted lever while they watched from the bank. Respect, Cassian was learning, had very little to do with titles and everything to do with showing up when the situation was ugly. They climbed in single file. The path to the ridge was a sheep track that wound upward through gorse and loose shale, slippery with rain and barely wide enough for a man carrying a pickaxe over his shoulder. Cassian walked near the front, one of the powder kegs strapped to his back with leather harness bands that cut into his shoulders with every step. The keg weighed close to 40 pounds, and by the time they reached the halfway point, his thighs were burning, and his breath came in short, ragged pulls that fogged the cold air in front of his face. He did not complain. He did not slow down. Two of the labourers had glanced back at him during the first quarter mile with expressions that suggested they expected the Duke to falter, to hand off his burden to a stronger man, to find some excuse to supervise from a comfortable distance. He gave them nothing to confirm that expectation. His boots slipped on the wet shale, and he caught himself with one hand, scraped his knuckles raw against the stone, and kept climbing. The ridgetop was a narrow shelf of exposed limestone, perhaps 60 feet long and 12 feet wide, jutting out from the hillside like the prow of a ship. The wind up here was vicious, a constant freezing blast that came across the open moor from the north and cut through every layer of wool and oilskin as though they were made of paper. Below and to the east, the valley spread out in a grey-green panorama of waterlogged fields and swollen streams, with Ravenwood Keep sitting at the centre like a stone island in a slowly rising sea. The river was visible as a broad, brown ribbon winding through the gorge, noticeably wider than it had been even the day before. Genevieve reached the shelf and immediately began working. She opened her father's notebook, oriented herself against the landscape, and started marking the rock face with red chalk. 3 precise crosses, each one positioned over a hairline crack in the limestone that was invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. She moved along the shelf with quick, deliberate steps, pausing at each mark to kneel down and press her fingers into the stone, feeling for the depth and direction of the fracture beneath. "Here," she said, tapping the first cross. 3 feet deep, angled at 30 degrees toward the south face. The charge sits at the base of the borehole, packed tight with clay wadding above it. She moved to the second mark. "Here, 2.5 feet, steeper angle, 40 degrees. This one opens the central fracture." She reached the third. "And here, the deepest bore, 4 feet straight down. This is the keystone charge. When this one fires, the entire spine of the ridge will separate along the fault line and drop away to the west." The labourers set to work with the pickaxes and iron bore rods, driving narrow holes into the limestone at the exact points and angles Genevieve had specified. The work was brutal. Each stroke of the pick sent sparks flying from the wet stone and jarred the arms of the man swinging it hard enough to loosen teeth. They worked in pairs, one man holding the bore rod steady while the other struck it with a heavy mallet, driving it inch by inch into the resistant rock. Cassian took his turn at the mallet. His blistered hands screamed against the wooden handle, and the impact travelled up through his wrists and elbows into his shoulders with each blow. By the second borehole, his palms were bleeding through the cloth wraps he had wound around them that morning. He kept swinging. The men beside him kept working. Nobody spoke except to call out depths and angles as Genevieve moved along the line, checking each hole with a measuring rod and adjusting the direction with small, precise instructions. By late afternoon, the 3 boreholes were complete. Genevieve knelt beside each one in turn, carefully lowering measured charges of black powder into the narrow shafts and tamping them down with long wooden rods and handfuls of stiff clay that she packed with her fingers. The fuse lines, slow-burning cord made of cotton soaked in saltpeter, were threaded into each charge and laid out along the rock shelf in careful, separated paths that converged at a single firing point 20 yards back from the ridge edge. The men gathered at the firing point as the last of the daylight bled out of the sky. They were filthy, exhausted, and cold to the bone. Their hands were raw, their muscles spent, and their clothing was so thoroughly soaked that it had stopped mattering hours ago. They looked, Cassian thought, like soldiers at the end of a long campaign, worn down to the essential core of themselves, with everything unnecessary stripped away by effort and weather. Genevieve stood at the edge of the shelf, looking down at the valley. The river had risen another 6 inches since the morning. The water behind the spillway was creeping upward again, dark and patient, pressing against the stone walls with the slow, relentless certainty of something that had all the time in the world. "Tomorrow," she said. "The river crests the day after. We fire the charges at dawn and let the diversion channel fill before the peak surge arrives." Holt stepped forward, pulling his cap off his grey head despite the rain. "Will it hold, ma'am? The channel, will it take the full weight of the flood?" Genevieve looked at the old groundskeeper. The wind whipped her loose hair across her face, and she pushed it back with a chalk-stained hand. "It will hold, Master Holt. The mathematics are sound, the geology is mapped, the charges are set." She paused. "My father surveyed this ridge 20 years ago and told Lord Vane it could be opened safely if the estate ever needed a relief channel. Vane buried the report because building a channel would have cost money he preferred to spend elsewhere. We are doing now what should have been done a generation ago." They descended the ridge in the fading light, picking their way down the slippery track with the careful, heavy-footed tread of men who had given everything they had and were running on the fumes of duty and stubbornness. Cassian walked at the rear, making sure no one was left behind on the dark hillside. Genevieve walked ahead of him, the empty powder keg slung over her shoulder, her boots finding the path with a sureness that seemed to owe nothing to sight and everything to some deeper instinct. The instinct of a woman who had spent her whole life navigating terrain that other people had made deliberately difficult for her, and who had learned to keep her footing regardless. Behind them, on the ridge, 3 fuse lines lay coiled in the darkness like sleeping serpents, waiting for the morning and the spark. The carriage arrived at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 10th day, and it was everything Cassian's was not. A gleaming black landau with polished brass fittings and matched bay horses, driven by a coachman in full livery who handled the reins with the stiff, rehearsed posture of a man who knew his employer was watching. The Vane family crest was painted on the door panel in gold leaf, the serpent coiled around the oak branch, and even the mud splashed along the lower panels seemed reluctant to cling too long to that immaculate black lacquer. Lord Aldrich Vane stepped out onto the cobblestones of the outer courtyard as though he were arriving at his own property. He wore a charcoal frock coat with velvet lapels, a silk cravat pinned with a single emerald, and polished boots that had clearly never touched unpaved ground. His silver hair was combed back from a high forehead, and his face wore that expression Cassian knew so well, the patient, amused superiority of a man who believed he had already won and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up to the fact. Behind him, a second carriage disgorged 2 men in dark coats carrying leather document cases. Local magistrates, Cassian recognized one of them, a man named Burrell, who administered the county court from the market town 8 miles east. Burrell had the unhappy expression of someone who would rather be anywhere else on a wet Tuesday morning, but who had been given instructions he lacked the authority to refuse. Word had spread quickly. A dozen estate tenants had gathered along the courtyard wall, standing in clusters of 2 and 3 beneath the dripping eaves of the stable block. Holt was among them, his weathered face set in a hard, watchful line. The labourers who had spent the previous day drilling boreholes on the ridge stood near the gate, still wearing their mud-caked work clothes, their hands wrapped in dirty bandages. Cassian waited on the front steps of the manor. He had washed, shaved, and put on the best coat he had left, a navy wool tailcoat that was slightly too tight across the shoulders because he had not worn it since before the week of physical labour that had thickened the muscles in his arms and back. Genevieve stood beside him, 1 step behind and slightly to the left, wearing her grey dress with the heavy shawl pulled up around her shoulders. She had tied her hair back in the familiar tight knot, and to anyone who did not know better, she looked exactly as Vane had designed her to look. Small, plain, forgettable. Vane crossed the courtyard with the easy, unhurried stride of a man walking through his own drawing room. He stopped at the foot of the steps, looked up at Cassian and smiled. "Nephew, you look tired." "Uncle, you look overdressed for a foreclosure." Vane's smile widened by a fraction. He turned to Burrell and extended an open hand. The magistrate hesitated, then reached into his document case and produced a folded sheet of heavy cream paper sealed with red wax. Vane took it and held it up between two fingers as though displaying a card trick. "A writ of structural condemnation," Vane said, loud enough for the assembled tenants to hear. "Issued by the County Surveyor's Office on my petition, supported by the testimony of 2 independent assessors who inspected the lower foundations last month and found them to be in a state of critical deterioration. The writ declares Ravenwood Keep structurally unsound and legally uninhabitable, and places the estate under the emergency oversight of the nearest solvent landholder." He paused, letting the words settle across the courtyard like the drizzle. "Which, by a convenient turn of circumstance, happens to be me." Cassian did not move. He kept his hands at his sides and his eyes on his uncle's face. A month ago, 2 weeks ago even, this moment would have broken him. The legal language, the official seal, the calm certainty of a man who had spent years engineering this exact outcome. Cassian would have crumbled. He would have shouted, or stormed inside, or reached for the nearest bottle of port and let the whole miserable business sort itself out without him. He felt none of that now. The week had burned it out of him. The timber hauling, the freezing river, the midnight calculations, the long climb up the ridge with 40 pounds of blasting powder strapped to his back. The old Cassian, the careless London duke who measured his life in card games and racing debts, felt like a stranger he had once known and no longer cared to remember. "The foundations are sound," Cassian said. Vane raised an eyebrow. "My surveyors say otherwise." "Your surveyors inspected the estate 6 weeks ago, before the substructure was reinforced. The fracture in the main arch has been stabilized, the sluice gates are operational, and the iron reinforcement rods from Oakhaven Foundry arrived this afternoon." Something shifted behind Vane's eyes, a flicker of surprise, quickly buried. He had not expected the foundry. He had agents watching the northern supply roads, and none of them had reported a commission being placed at Oakhaven. Genevieve had been right about that. The advantage of dealing with a man like Corran was that the master smith answered to his own conscience and nobody else's network of informants. Vane recovered his composure within a heartbeat. He turned his gaze to Genevieve, standing silent on the step behind Cassian, and his expression shifted to something uglier, a kind of theatrical pity laced with contempt. "And I suppose this is the architect of your salvation," he said. "The girl who cannot string a sentence together without stammering over her own tongue. Tell me, nephew, did she manage to hold the measuring tape the right way round, or did you have to show her which end was which?" Laughter from one of the hired men standing near the second carriage. The tenants along the wall did not laugh. They had watched Genevieve work. They had seen her waist-deep in the spillway, chalk-stained on the ridge, covered in river clay in the cellar at 3 in the morning. Whatever Vane's version of her was, theirs had been rewritten by a week of evidence. Cassian stepped forward. He moved down 1 step, then another, placing himself directly between Vane and Genevieve. The physical positioning was deliberate. He was taller than his uncle by 3 inches, and standing on the lower step brought them exactly eye to eye. "The estate is fully sound," Cassian said. His voice was quiet, steady, and carried clearly across the silent courtyard. "It is solvent, it is protected, and every repair, every reinforcement, every structural improvement made in the past 10 days has been designed and directed by Genevieve Marchand Ashworth, my wife, and the most capable engineer I have ever encountered. Her master plan for the estate's flood defense is complete, and it will be executed tomorrow morning. Your writ is based on outdated evidence and fraudulent testimony, and I will challenge it in open court if necessary." Vane studied his nephew for a long, measuring moment. The courtyard was utterly still. Even the rain seemed to pause, as though the weather itself were holding its breath. Then Vane folded the writ neatly, slipped it into his breast pocket, and smiled again, thinner this time, harder, with the patience of a man who still held cards he had not yet played. "By all means, nephew, execute your plan. I will wait." He glanced up at the darkening sky, where the clouds were thickening into the dense, iron-colored mass that promised the heaviest rainfall yet. "I suspect the river will settle the matter for us, and when it does, I will be standing right here with the paperwork already signed." He turned, climbed back into his gleaming carriage, and rode away down the drive. Burrell and the second magistrate followed in their own vehicle, neither of them having spoken a single word throughout the entire encounter. Cassian watched the carriages disappear into the grey mist. Behind him, Genevieve's hand rested briefly on his arm, just a touch, light and quick, there and gone before anyone else could notice. "Tomorrow," she said. Cassian nodded. The sky above them rumbled with distant thunder, and somewhere up the valley, the Blackwood River roared its answer. The 11th day began in darkness. Cassian was dressed and standing in the courtyard by 4 o'clock, long before any trace of light touched the eastern horizon. The air was thick with moisture, a strange, heavy stillness that pressed against the skin like damp cloth. The wind had dropped completely during the night, which should have been a relief but instead felt ominous, as though the valley were drawing a deep breath before a scream. Genevieve emerged from the manor, carrying a canvas roll of tools under one arm and a coil of fuse cord over the other. She had abandoned the grey dress entirely. In its place, she wore a pair of Holt's old work trousers cinched with a leather belt, a heavy cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a short wool jacket that had probably belonged to one of the stable boys before his growth put him out of it. Her hair was braided back in a single thick plait that hung between her shoulder blades. She looked, for the first time since Cassian had known her, like someone wearing clothes that actually fit the person inside them. The labourers assembled in silence. 11 men, plus Holt and his son. They carried lanterns, rope coils, and the slow match igniters that Genevieve had prepared the previous evening, strips of treated cotton cord, each one measured and cut to burn at a precise, predictable rate. Every man had been assigned a position on the ridge, a specific task, and a retreat path that Genevieve had walked them through twice by candlelight after supper. There was no confusion. There was no hesitation. These men had been farmers, stable hands, and groundskeepers a fortnight ago. The past 11 days had turned them into something closer to a military engineering corps. They climbed the ridge path in single file, lanterns bobbing in the darkness like a procession of fireflies ascending the black hillside. The ground was saturated. Each step released a small gush of water from the soil, and the sheep track had become a shallow stream in its own right, running downhill between their boots. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the squelch of footsteps, the clink of iron tools, and the distant, growing roar of the Blackwood River swelling toward its peak somewhere in the darkness below. They reached the shelf just as the first grey light crept over the eastern hills. Cassian looked down into the valley and felt his stomach drop. The river had transformed overnight. The Blackwood was no longer a river, it was a moving wall of brown water, stretching bank to bank across the gorge and surging southward with a speed and power that made the earlier flooding look like a garden puddle. Trees that had stood along the banks for decades were gone, ripped from the earth and carried downstream as battering rams. The water behind the spillway had risen to within 2 feet of the top of the sluice gates, and the old stone walls were darkened to the capstone with damp. Ravenwood Keep sat in the centre of it all, like a grey stone fist clenched against the flood. From up here, Cassian could see how fragile it truly was, how thin the margin between survival and collapse, how much depended on the calculations of one woman and the strength of ancient walls that had never been tested against a flood of this magnitude. "Check the charges," Genevieve said. Her voice was calm, but Cassian noticed that she held the canvas tool roll very tightly, her knuckles white against the dark fabric. She was afraid. She was going ahead anyway. 2 labourers moved along the shelf, inspecting each borehole, confirming that the powder charges were dry and the clay tamping was intact. The fuse lines were uncoiled and laid out along their designated paths, 3 separate cords, each one running from its charge point back to the central firing position, where they converged at a single ignition point. Genevieve knelt beside each junction, testing the connections with her fingers, making small adjustments with the focused precision of a watchmaker, assembling a mechanism that would either save everything or destroy it. "The timing matters," she said, looking up at Cassian. "The charges must fire in sequence, the southern bore first, then the central, then the keystone. If they fire simultaneously, the force will shatter the ridge unevenly and the channel walls will collapse inward. The fuse lengths are cut to create a 2-second delay between each detonation. That is enough time for each fracture to propagate before the next charge opens the adjoining fault line." Cassian knelt beside her. "Tell me what you need." "I need you to light the fuse. One steady flame, held to the ignition point until the cord catches. Then you walk. You do not run, because running on wet limestone will put you on your back. You walk to the retreat point behind the boulder line. You will have approximately 40 seconds before the first charge fires." "And where will you be?" "Here, watching. I need to see the fracture pattern as it develops. If the first charge does not open the southern fault cleanly, I will need to make a decision about the remaining two." "What sort of decision?" "Whether to let them fire or cut the fuse lines and re-drill." Cassian stared at her. "You would be standing on a shelf of rock that is in the process of splitting apart. I would be standing at the observation point, which is 12 feet from the nearest borehole and on the stable side of the primary fault line. I have calculated the blast radius. I will be outside it." "By how much?" Genevieve met his eyes. "Enough." There was no arguing with her. Cassian had learned that over the past 11 days, when Genevieve had done the mathematics were final. He could question her judgment, but he could not question her numbers, because her numbers had been right every single time. The men retreated to the boulder line, 30 yards back from the shelf edge. Holt positioned himself at the far end of the line, ready to signal the all clear to the valley below once the blast was complete. His son stood beside him, wide-eyed and gripping a coiled rope with both hands. Cassian crouched at the ignition point, a lit taper in his right hand. The slow match cord lay on the wet rock in front of him, its frayed end dark with saltpeter. 20 yards away, Genevieve stood at her observation point, her father's notebook open in her hands, her eyes fixed on the rock face. She looked at him across the distance. The wind had picked up again, pulling at her braid and pressing the wool jacket flat against her shoulders. Below them, the river roared. Above them, the clouds churned. She nodded once. Cassian touched the taper to the fuse. The cord caught with a soft hiss, and a bright orange spark began its slow, steady crawl along the wet rock toward the first borehole. Cassian set the taper down, rose to his feet, and walked steadily, deliberately, without running, to the boulder line. He reached it, turned, and stood beside Holt with his eyes fixed on the ridge. 7 seconds. The spark reached the first junction and split, one line continuing toward the southern bore, the other curling toward the central charge on its 2-second delay. 15 seconds. The spark disappeared into the first borehole. A deep, heavy thump shook the ground beneath their feet, felt more than heard, like the beat of an enormous drum buried deep in the earth. A crack appeared in the limestone face, running diagonally from the borehole toward the valley edge, and a sheet of rock the size of a barn door shifted outward by 6 inches, then a foot, then simply fell away into the slope below with a grinding roar that sent dust and fragments flying upward into the grey air. Genevieve did not move. Her eyes tracked the fracture line, following its path through the stone, reading the geology as it unfolded in real time. The second charge fired. Another thump, sharper this time, and the central fault split open with a crack that echoed across the valley like a cannon shot. The ridge shuddered, and a wide section of the shelf dropped 2 feet as the rock beneath it separated along the ancient fracture plane. Then the keystone charge. The deepest bore, the largest load, the one that mattered most. The thump was deeper, longer, and the entire spine of the ridge seemed to groan and sag as the final fault line gave way. A massive slab of limestone, 40 feet long and 12 feet thick, tilted slowly westward, hung for a moment as though considering its options, and then slid away from the ridge face with a sound like tearing cloth magnified 1,000 times. Behind it, the river found the gap. Brown water surged through the opening in a frothing, churning torrent that poured down the western slope toward the old quarry basin, carving a wide channel through the broken rock as it went. The sound was immense, a sustained, thundering rush that drowned out the wind, the rain, and every other noise in the valley. Cassian watched the water pour through the breach, watched it spread across the quarry basin in a vast, harmless fan of brown foam, watched the level behind the spillway begin to drop, inch by inch, then foot by foot, as the diverted flow drained the pressure from the gorge. Genevieve walked back from the observation point. Her face was streaked with limestone dust, and her hands were trembling. She stopped beside Cassian, looked down into the valley where Ravenwood Keep sat dry and solid in its hollow, and let out a long, shaking breath that fogged the cold morning air. The labourers broke into rough, exhausted cheering. Holt pulled off his cap and waved it above his head. His son was laughing. Below, in the courtyard of the manor, a black landau sat motionless in the grey drizzle. From the ridge, Cassian could just make out the figure of Lord Vane, standing beside his polished carriage, watching the floodwater pour harmlessly around the estate he had spent years trying to destroy. "It held," Cassian said. Genevieve wiped the dust from her eyes with the back of her hand. "I told you it would." The clouds broke on the 12th morning, as though someone had drawn back a curtain. Cassian woke to something he had not seen in nearly a fortnight: sunlight. It came through the bedroom window in a long, warm shaft that fell across the floorboards and lit up the dust motes drifting in the still air like flecks of gold suspended in amber. He lay there for a moment, listening. The wind had stopped, the rain had stopped, and for the first time since his wedding night, the house beneath him was silent, genuinely, deeply silent, without the groaning of stressed stone or the trembling of saturated earth or the distant roar of water pressing against walls that were never meant to hold it. He dressed and went downstairs. The manor smelled of damp plaster and wood smoke and something else underneath, something older and cleaner, like stone drying in the sun after a long season underground. The servants had opened every window on the south face of the house, and a mild breeze moved through the corridors, carrying the scent of wet grass and the first tentative birdsong Cassian had heard in days. The great hall had been transformed. The long oak table that normally gathered dust beneath dustcloths had been uncovered and scrubbed, and someone, Holt's wife, Cassian suspected, had laid it with whatever the kitchen could muster: cold mutton, bread, hard cheese, a cask of cider, and a bowl of preserved plums that had survived the flooding of the root cellar by virtue of sitting on the highest shelf. It was not a feast by any London standard. It was the most welcome table Cassian had ever seen. The tenants began arriving by mid-morning. They came on foot, on horseback, in farm carts with mud still caked on the wheels, families from the outlying cottages and small holdings that dotted the Ravenwood estate across 3 parishes. They came because word had travelled fast through the valley, the way it always did in close rural communities where every hedge and field boundary connected one household to the next. The Duke's wife had blown open a hillside and turned the flood. The manor was standing, the land was dry. These were facts worth walking 5 miles to confirm with your own eyes. By noon, the great hall was full. Tenant farmers in their Sunday coats stood alongside estate labourers still wearing their work clothes from the ridge. Holt's son had scrubbed his face, but missed the limestone dust behind his ears. The village blacksmith had come, and the miller whose grain store had been saved by the diversion channel, and the old woman who kept the toll gate on the southern road, and who claimed she had felt the blast charges go off in her hip joints from 3 miles away. Regional gentry arrived as well. Sir Edwin Platt from the neighbouring estate, who had ridden over to see the diversion channel for himself and returned shaking his head in frank amazement. The widow Harcastle, who owned 400 acres of sheep pasture along the ridge and who had been preparing to evacuate her flocks before the flood reversed course overnight. And young Mr. Cavendish, a solicitor from the county town, who had been quietly sympathetic to Cassian's situation and who had brought with him something far more valuable than his good wishes: He had brought documents. Cassian stood at the head of the long table and waited for the room to settle. The murmur of conversation faded slowly, replaced by the shuffling of boots and the creak of old chairs as people found their places. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of warmth across the stone floor and illuminating the faces turned toward him, expectant, curious, cautious. He had never addressed an assembly like this. In London, he had given toasts at dinner parties, witty, careless, usually half drunk, and made brief speeches at club gatherings that nobody remembered the following morning. This was different. These people had homes on his land. Their livelihoods depended on the ground beneath their feet, and that ground had very nearly been pulled out from under them by a man who shared Cassian's own blood. "I owe this estate an apology," Cassian said. The room went quiet. "For years, I treated Ravenwood as an inheritance to be spent rather than a responsibility to be honored. I neglected this house, these lands, and every person who depended on them. That neglect created the conditions that nearly brought the entire estate down around our ears. I cannot undo that. I can only tell you that the man standing in front of you today is not the same man who arrived here a fortnight ago, and I intend to prove that with actions rather than words." He paused, then turned to Cavendish, who stepped forward and placed a leather folio on the table. Inside were the documents Genevieve had carried in her battered tin box, the original blueprints, the stress calculations, the patent filings in her handwriting alongside the fraudulent copies bearing Vane's name and seal. Cavendish had spent the previous evening reviewing them against the county patent registry and had confirmed what Genevieve had known for years. Every single filing was stolen. "These are the original engineering patents and architectural designs created by Genevieve Marchand," Cassian said, laying the documents out across the table where the nearest tenants could see them. They were taken from her by Lord Vane, filed under his own name, and used to secure commercial contracts worth thousands of pounds, contracts built on her expertise and her father's legacy. The drainage system that failed beneath this house was her design, deliberately weakened by Vane's refusal to follow her specifications. The diversion channel that saved us yesterday was also her design, drawn from surveys her father completed 20 years ago and executed under her sole direction. He turned to Genevieve. She was standing near the window, slightly apart from the crowd, in a position that a week ago would have been a retreat, a way of making herself invisible along the edges of the room. But her posture had changed. Her shoulders were straight, her chin was level. Her hands hung at her sides without fidgeting, without clutching at shawls or sleeves or the edges of her oversized clothing. She was wearing a new dress, or rather, an old one, altered. Holt's wife had taken one of the late Duchess's mourning gowns from a cedar trunk in the attic and spent the previous evening adjusting it with pins and careful stitching. It was a deep blue-grey wool, simple in cut, without lace or ornament, but it fit Genevieve properly for the first time since she had arrived at Ravenwood. The heavy veils were gone, the shapeless sacking was gone. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman of intelligence and composure who had spent a decade being deliberately hidden and who had decided, quietly, to stop. "Genevieve Marchand Ashworth is the rightful author of every patent Lord Vane claimed as his own," Cassian said. "She is the architect who identified the structural failure beneath this house on the night of our wedding, who secured the materials and labor to reinforce it, who cleared the sabotaged sluice gates with her own hands, and who designed and executed the controlled detonation that diverted the flood and saved this estate. She is the mistress of Ravenwood, and she is the most remarkable person I have ever had the good fortune to stand beside." The room was still. Then Holt began to clap, a slow, heavy clap, his rough hands meeting with the solid, deliberate rhythm of a man who did not give his approval lightly. His son joined in, then the labourers who had worked the ridge, then the tenants, then Sir Edwin, then the widow Harcastle, until the great hall filled with a sound that was louder than any river or any blast charge. The sound of people acknowledging what they had seen with their own eyes. Genevieve stepped forward from the window. She did not stammer. She did not stutter. She did not hunch her shoulders or drop her gaze to the floor. She walked to the head of the table and stood beside Cassian. And when she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the room with the same clear, steady authority it had carried in the cellar, on the ridge, at the forge, and at the sluice gates.
"Thank you," she said. "All of you. This estate did not survive because of one person. It survived because every man on that hillside yesterday trusted the mathematics enough to stake his labor on it, and because every family in this valley understood that the land beneath their feet was worth fighting for." She paused. "I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain it remains worth fighting for." Cassian looked at her. The sunlight caught the side of her face, and he saw in her expression something he had never seen in any ballroom or drawing room or card table in all his wasted years. The look of someone who had been given back to herself, fully and completely, after a long time spent locked away. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. Her fingers were still rough with chalk dust and calluses, and his were still raw with blisters and healing cuts. They were not the hands of a duke and his lady. They were the hands of two people who had earned each other the hard way, through mud and iron and limestone and rain. Outside, the river ran calm and low through its new channel, glinting silver in the morning sun. The walls of Ravenwood Keep stood solid against the pale sky, dry and warm for the first time in a fortnight. And somewhere down the valley road, a polished black landau was carrying Lord Vane away from an estate he would never touch again, his foreclosure writ still folded in his breast pocket, unsigned, unexecuted, and utterly worthless. The serpent had been out-engineered.